Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll let folks join for just a moment or two, but while you're joining, if you would like to share in the chat your university or college or where you're joining in the world from today. Welcome to day 5 of the 2025 GradFUTURES Forum Graduate Student Professional Development Conference, hosted by the Graduate School at Princeton University. My name is Peter Kraus, and I'm the Assistant Director for Graduate Experiential Programs on the GradFUTURES team. Now in its 6th year, we're thrilled to host a full week of transformative professional development and career exploration for our diverse community of talented scholars, researchers, and leaders. With participants from more than 60 graduate institutions across the globe, we come together to learn, to explore, and to forge meaningful connections. This year's theme, Meeting the Moment, reflects our collective commitment to navigating current challenges with purpose and with vision. We're deeply grateful to our exceptional speakers and panelists who will share their expertise, their practical advice, and inspiration throughout the week. Our team has carefully crafted a program that aims to empower you with the clarity, the practical skills, and the valuable connections and a renewed sense of agency. While there may be questions for which none of us has the answers right now, we are dedicated to providing information and support with real-time relevance to your success in graduate school and beyond. It is now my pleasure to introduce Margarita Belova, graduate student in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering and GradFUTURES Professional Development Associate, who will serve as moderator for this session, Beyond Borders, Designing Your Future as an International PhD Scholar. Welcome, Margarita.
Thank you, Peter. It's my honor to introduce today's topic, Designing Your Future for International PhD Scholars by Sonali Majumdar. This topic is close to my heart. As a GradFUTURES Professional Development Associate, I'm working with Sonali and fellow PDAs to develop a professional development series for international graduate students in Princeton. And this is the first of many seminars we will host this year, and hopefully the following years too. Before I introduce Sonali, a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with attendees. Please use Q&A feature to pose questions. We will try to address them live or on chat time permitting. Today's speaker, Sonali Majumdar, joined the GradFUTURES team in May of 2022 as Assistant Dean for Professional Development. In addition to developing programs and building partnerships to benefit all graduate students, Sonali serves as the primary liaison for graduate students and faculty in the natural sciences and engineering divisions. Nationally, she contributes to the field through the Graduate Career Consortium. She served on the executive committee as communication officer. Sonali earned her PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology at the University of Georgia and did postdoctoral training at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. For international PhD students in the US, navigating doctoral training and careers often means confronting unique challenges and restrictions that can limit our vision of what's possible. This innovative seminar empowers you to transform restrictive thinking into expansive opportunity through a powerful creative framework for imagining parallel futures that transcend common barriers facing international scholars. This framework and additional insights shared in this talk are from Sonali's forthcoming book, Thriving as an International Scientist by University of California Press in fall 2025. Welcome, Sonali.
Thank you, Margarita, and thank you all for joining. It's my honor to give this talk at the GradFUTURES Forum. This is my second talk at the GradFUTURES Forum. My first talk was at 2022, which was also on strengths of international scientists and scholars. You can find that video of the talk on our YouTube channel. Professional development for international PhDs is personal for me. As Margarita mentioned, I'm also an international scientist who's been through the PhD and postdoc training, as well as career changes in the US amid challenges and uncertainties. I've navigated 3 different career paths and learned a lot in the process. My professional life started in the healthcare sector as a clinical embryologist in India. I was part of a small team of physicians and embryologists who were tasked with setting up a new IVF center. After 2 to 3 years of doing that, I wasn't intellectually satisfied. That's a recurrent theme in my career. And I felt like I was using my hands more than my head. And that's when I decided to follow my curiosity of the world of research. And I moved to the US for a PhD program at UGA, followed by a postdoc in Sloan Kettering. Trained as an RNA biologist, I investigated CRISPR-Cas systems in my PhD research and studied roles of RNAs in brain development as well as cancer models in my postdoc. But yet again, I came to a point where I felt like I was being more creative outside the lab. I became energized to solve a different and a more emergent problem of improving scientific training, of training scientists for the diverse careers they somehow find their way to. I volunteered to build ecosystems as well as opportunities for postdoc professional development in New York City as a postdoc leader. And following that passion, I moved to my 3rd career track of building PhD professional development programs and ecosystems, first at University of Virginia and now at Princeton. In the process, I've moved from one visa alphabet soup to another, testing limits of systems and leveraging creativity and support networks. However, my story isn't singular. I'm one among many international PhDs in the US who do the same without adequate or established mechanisms of support. That said, majority of us in this crowd are possibly PhDs, and we love to look at data. So let's start with looking at a bit of data at the demographic of international PhD population in the US. What you're seeing right now is data from open access dashboards and tables reported by NSF on the Survey of Earned Doctorate, which is an annual census of new research doctoral recipients from accredited colleges and universities in the US. I reanalyzed the PhD population-wide data, and I use this as it's one of the most robust studies on PhD experience in the US and post-PhD career commitments. A lot of this data leans heavier on the science engineering side, but NSF actually started including humanities and social sciences outcomes and experiences midway around 2013. So what you see here is in 2022, international PhDs or foreign-born, the way that I define it here, are foreign-born visa holders, make up about 39.4% of current PhD students enrolled in programs across the United States, and 53% of postdocs. As well as when you look at PhD recipients over years between 1977 to 2022, which is on the right-hand side, you'll see that international PhDs make up 34% of PhD recipients in 2022 compared to 11% in 77. There's been a steady growth of international PhDs across the year, as you can see in the trend lines. And the trend line also indicates that the steady growth is very similar to the trend lines of the overall population, indicating that the growth of international PhDs has been a boon for the PhD and the research ecosystem in the United States. Now let's look at some of the reported post-PhD commitments or career outcomes that our respondents in NSF Survey of Earned Doctorates reported. When we look at the last 30 years between 1992 to 2022, this question asks them about their first destination right after PhD, about their career paths, and whether they were continuing in postdoc training, which you can see in red, or any sort of first outcome or employment commitments, which you see in blue. Over the years, you can see that the trend lines are pretty similar. 1992, approximately 60% of international PhDs were in reported employment outcomes. And the same thing you can kind of see back and forth in 2022. However, something to remember that we just saw in the last slide, that the number of PhDs have steadily grown over years. So the 60% in 2022 is actually 2.5 times more in numbers of PhDs who are in the employment workforce. Now, if we look at the folks who reported employment outcomes and look at the distribution of sector of those outcomes over years, you'll see that vast majority of those who are in employment but not postdocs are in the industry or business sector. And the second most likely outcome is academic paths, which again does not include postdocs. These are either faculty, researchers, or other tracks. 72.3% of them in 2022 reported outcome in the industry sector, which is amazing and kind of shows to how much international PhDs are contributing to US competitiveness and growth in business and innovation. But it's also an indication of the technology boom that we saw in the middle of the pandemic. And if we are going to look at the next few years, there's probably likely going to be a downturn given the climate. But there's another thing to note in here is just the binary of outcomes between industry and academia. If you were really going to look at career diversity or diversity of global talent pool across different sectors, including government and nonprofit and entrepreneurship as well, you would see that international PhDs are quite underrepresented in some of these sectors. And therefore, it's important for us to start investing in professional development of international scientists and really support not just the scientists, but also the employers who are hiring them to enable more distribution of career outcomes. But let's take a step back to first understand what are some of the gaps. And these are gaps for all PhDs, domestic and international, when it comes to career and professional development. There's gap of knowledge, information gap sometimes about self, about what you are interested in, what your values are. And yesterday's talk on designing for your future addressed some of that. There's also an information and knowledge gap about the possibilities and the career paths that a lot of PhDs succeed in, as well as thrive and find fulfillment in. The second is a gap of network. And this is especially hard for internationals who move countries and have to rebuild their professional network from scratch. So there's definitely that's another area that we need to develop for our PhDs as well as international PhDs. And finally, the skills gap. As the market is changing, new jobs are emerging, there is a dynamic skills interplay and this need for constant and regular lifelong learning, which we heard from Matt Sigelman's talk in the GradFUTURES Forum this week. And that is something that all PhDs have to grapple with, where the half-life of skills might be moving fast and you'll have to constantly keep up on upskilling to remain competitive in the fields that you're interested in. But the thing is, I take solace from this that nobody really knows what they want to do next. And this book by Bill Burnett and Dave Evans has been really groundbreaking for me as I was doing my postdoc. And I talk about it a lot to the students I advise, as well as the postdocs I've advised in the past. And I'm pulling out a quote from this book to just say that, nobody really knows what they want to be. What everyone needs is a process to figure out what they want, who they want to grow into, and how to create a life that they love. And I've customized this career development process in some of the workshops that I present at Princeton called the Focus on Future You, where we've basically taken the idea that one thing that researchers know how to do are research skills. And how can we leverage the research skills and lean with that into your career development? And so the first step is really going into the journey of self-discovery, which ends up becoming very difficult for a lot of scientists and scholars to really research yourself, your skills, your interests, your values, and how things evolve as your experiences change. In parallel, also researching dynamic professions that are out there so that you can have a good idea of what are some things that you might like being involved in the near future. And with that knowledge, you can start thinking about designing different kinds of paths, assuming and making assumptions that there might be constraints and restrictions on one path or the other, and therefore finding ways to still get to where you want to. While you are doing this, it's imperative to assess the diverse scenarios, and these are two steps that we'll focus more on today for internationals, to really understand where might be roadblocks, where there might be constraints, and how might you overcome that or address it or work around it. Finally, as you are going through these steps, you have to also use the power of storytelling to identify and communicate the skills that you have through your PhD or postdoc experience or your prior work experience. And then also assess what are the skills that you need to upskill to meet the competitive demand of the market, in the job market that you are interested in. And that will help you define what your professional development goals and plans will be for any of these different paths that you map for your career. But this is the time that is also to, let's take a moment to really think about this important concept that we typically call constraints or challenges. But in this book, the authors define it as gravity problems, which I feel like it's a really great framing. They define gravity problems as something as not real problems in the way that it's not actionable. If it's not actionable, it's not a problem. It's a situation, a circumstance, a fact of life. It's like a gravity, it may be a drag, but it's not a problem that can be solved. And I like to extend to it to say that it's a problem that cannot be solved by an individual, but will require systemic change or collective action. And as you might imagine, for internationals, the primary example of this gravity problem is immigration systems that are challenging and have been dated for a while and need to be kept up with the changing dynamics of workforce. It also behooves us to take a second to take a look at what are the typical immigration pathways for international PhDs in the US, to really understand the challenges that they face for career dynamic changes, so to speak. And at this point, I'd also like to point out that I'm not an immigration attorney and I do not have any legal background. These are information that I've sourced from the USCIS publicly available sites. And what this slide shows you are just some typical visas that most international PhDs would use at some point in their career in the US. For training purposes, after they finish their PhD, they have the option to take an optional practical training or OPT on their student visas, or a scholar researcher visa on J1. For work purposes, the most popular one is H-1B that a lot of people have heard about. There are two types of H-1B, so to speak. Some of them are capped. Those are the ones most typically used in industry. And some of them are not capped by the maximum numbers, but for each year. And those are typically the ones used in academia or research institutes. O1 is also this distinct kind of visa that a lot of PhDs use for outstanding researchers category, which again, not a lot of people know about and should be utilized more. And finally, to get to permanent residency, as a lot of these temporary visas, as the name suggests, you can only get it for 3 to 6 years. most folks work towards a permanent residency in the employment-based category in any of these three different categories. And there's a separate category for entrepreneurs as well. All that to say, this is very challenging, convoluted, and for citizens of some nations can take over a decade to make to the permanent residency path. And so this is a real problem when it comes to career development and transitions for international. As you might imagine, because this is such a colossal gravity problem, this limits imagination of possibilities among internationals. A lot of us end up planning our futures around what's possible, around visas, and it forces you into a deficit thinking mindset that's driven by the restrictions and regulations. And I've seen this in my own career and life, where I had to constantly fight this deficit mindset and really lean on curiosity and creativity, which I had developed and really exercised through my research and use that in my career path as well. And so I would encourage all of you in here to do the same thing in really like leveraging your research skills and applying it to your career development. The second thing that's important to speak is mindset. Using abundance mindset and not self-limiting options. What does that mean? Not looking at the type of visas that you think are available, for example, and taking a small piece of the pie because you think all of these other options are not open for you. That's deficit thinking. Think of ways in which you might be able to expand the pie or mix combinations of something, you create your own pie, where this is where you can kind of take advantage of the abundance mindset on fighting the restrictions. The second fundamental concept that is helpful in this regard is growth mindset. The more you are used to embracing lifelong learning and upskilling to stay competitive, you will be more getting into that mindset of abundance over restrictions because you learn a lot more. Because one of the fundamental issues is you don't know what you don't know. Once you start learning and you become aware of options, that's when your growth mindset also goes hand in hand with planning for abundance and not restriction. And the second thing to think about while you are exercising lifelong learning is being strategic about how you invest your time or money. There's tons of free resources that are offered by your university towards professional development. A lot of universities have free licenses to LinkedIn Learning, for example, and that is something that students and postdocs should take more advantage of. The second thing that you have to think about while you are planning for your future is really relying on circles of people, building your community of career mentors. And I want to take a minute to really break down the kinds of roles that people can play in your life when you're thinking about your future. First of all, let's take a second to distinguish between an advisor, a mentor, and a sponsor. An advisor is someone who can really guide and advise you on a process or something specific, but they may or may not have the background to help with your specific circumstance or context in life. A mentor, on the other hand, might have a shared background and maybe really be able to help and assist and guide you with your specific needs in mind in a specific process or circumstance. And finally, a sponsor is someone who opens opportunities and doors for you and helps you, empowers you, enables opportunities and careers on your behalf. So if we put this as an example, let's take peer review as an example, because that's something that a lot of internationals really have to get into to build their immigration portfolio. Your advisor could be someone who helps you understand how to do peer review, breaks down the process, tells you how to respond to people. but they may or may not share an international background and may not know about the challenges that a non-native English speaker, for example, faces. A mentor, on the other hand, could help you really overcome the specific challenges you're facing as a non-native English speaker, whether they're contextual or cultural, in understanding the peer review process. And when it comes to a sponsor, they may be even open to opening opportunities for you to do peer reviews through, in the journals and such. They could be an editor or someone who would enable those opportunities for you. So those are sort of like the distinctions for each sets of people that you cultivate. So as you are thinking about your next steps and mapping your future paths, think about the circle you would cultivate for the different roles people can play in your life. So now let's talk about how do you design parallel paths to really account for restrictions, challenges that might come along the way, circumstances that can change at any given time, which would require you to be flexible and dynamic to still move towards what you think is success. Think of this as the directions to a destination and using, say, Google Maps to get somewhere. You may have your favorite route to go somewhere, which takes you there in 10-15 minutes. But if that route is mired with traffic or closed for construction, you quickly compute something else on Google Map. Maybe you take the second path, which is actually longer, undulating, but it gets you there and it's a safe path. Or you become adventurous and you take a third path and take a pit stop and you decide what to do there. But then by then you probably see, oh, there's somewhere else you could still get the same thing, maybe a different shopping center, and change your direction. Or you have time to recalibrate and get back to the same destination that you were intending to do. So that is the idea of designing multiple ways to get to a path, wayfinding, for example. In your research context, you do this quite frequently in troubleshooting when experiments fail. You change one variable at a time to figure out what went wrong, and then you try to pivot or make things flexible in getting to what you are planning to get. While you are planning these different paths, there are some things that you need to break down in the process. And I've created this framework that would help you as you're designing these paths. First is really defining success. And this is probably the most hard thing in the process because it's harder to really define why you want to do once you what you think is success. Once you have clarity of purpose, it's easier to break the process down and reverse engineer from there. So first, really ask yourself why you think that specific thing is success. What do you really want to achieve? And write that down for yourself. And from there, you can kind of think about, okay, what's negotiable and what's not negotiable, and then break that down process to create the 3 different paths that you will. The second thing is strategies, thinking about long-term or short-term strategies. So for example, in the short term, you could, as you're taking this incremental path too, you can keep working towards something that would work for the long term. But in the short term, you're just making some compromises or workarounds. Or in the analogy of doing experiment troubleshooting, you're changing 1 or 2 variables but to get to something very similar to what you intended. Once you have strategies in place, you can start also looking at what is out there, what kind of data exists, what resources exist, who are some successful examples of internationals who have walked those paths before, people who can provide you information, people who can become your mentors, possibly even your sponsors over time. And then with the knowledge, some idea of paths, you start to really map out your action plan, to develop skills, to look at what kind of timelines are reasonable to actually achieve those skills and what you want to do to get to your success, to really curate the groups of people, whether they are mentors, folks who might sponsor opportunities for you, folks who might provide recommendation for you to others, And most importantly, also along the whole process, having that community of support that you can rely on for both psychosocial as well as professional support. And so the linchpin in the center for no matter which path you design, the shortest, the undulating path to, or your adventurous detour, are people, information, resources, and community of support. So that is something that is at the core of this framework that you should always think about who those are and what those are. So let's take a few minutes to look at two different case studies on how you might be applying this. Two different thorny problems that internationals face, one during their PhD, postdoc, and research in general, is finding success for funding, because a lot of funding opportunities are not open to internationals. So for example, you're in such a situation, you might have a small proportion of federal fellowships, example, NIH K99, which are open to internationals. You apply to those knowing that they are very competitive, but they also have the high risk, high reward situation going on. So you you really prepare for it and apply. In the second path, you could focus on possibly non-federal sources if you did not have a lot of options in the federal fellowships or funding sources. They could be institutional, they could be from private sector or foundations, or they could also be international funding that are open to international grad students and postdocs. In the short term, you can look at all of these different smaller awards possibly, and then at the same time, work on a long-term strategy, for example, getting a permanent residency, which could create more options. The third could be that you consider something that you haven't yet, like talk to your faculty advisor. See if they are open to co-developing a proposal where you can serve as a co-investigator, especially if you're a postdoc, you could do that. Or really work on a proposal with them without credit. And they could still write you a letter of recommendation and say that this whole work was more yours than theirs, although their name is on it. And their word would matter a lot in that case. So you get the point. There's different ways to still go where you are thinking about, as long as you are open to really exploring creative options. And in the process, again, if we break this down, at first you have to start with clarity of purpose. Why do you want funding success? It could be because you want to establish that you have ideas that are fundable, that people think is good to invest in. You might want to have career agency, where you can explore ideas outside of what your lab or faculty advisor wants to prioritize. The creative strategies in the long and the short term would involve looking at diverse sources of funding, primarily non-federal sources. Exploring immigration advancement in the long term so that more options open up for you, as well as working with your faculty advisor to see if there is a way that you could be a co-investigator or get a letter of recommendation that establishes that this idea was yours and the work is primarily yours. It would also require you to gather data on what's possible as you're doing this, which would be discovering funding. In the talk at 1 o'clock, we looked at a few resources and platforms, which gives you idea of what funding sources are out there and which ones might be open to internationals. Looking at successful examples of peers, alumni, networks of people who have established and got such funding, who might be internationals, talking to them to see what the paths that they took, the resources that they took advantage of. And finally, coming up with action plan on what kind of skills do you need? Do you want to improve your grantsmanship skills? Do you know what fellowship timelines are and how much time you might need to prepare? Start working on getting those letters of recommendations and people who will provide those letters, working on cultivating those early because those take time. And also looking at people who might be open to giving you feedback on your proposal as you're working on it. And as always, finding and relying on that community of support along the way. Now let's look at the second case study, which is the career development and success. Let's say you figure out you want to do something next. For example, science policy. You found an employer who actually sponsors for visas, and you're all set then. You are on your way on path one. But for something like a non-traditional path like science policy, it might be hard for a lot of internationals, as some of the postdoc fellowships in those require citizenship requirement or permanent residency. And so in that case, you might want to start looking at what path two is, which is starting to work on your immigration portfolio early, as well as finding employers who are open to sponsoring visas where you can do parts of this job. So in the science policy example, looking at universities or university adjacent institutes that do a lot of policy analysis and research where an international could possibly work on some of the projects. And you're in the meantime developing the skills that will make you kind of get back to the federal policy landscape that you are interested in once you have your permanent residency. The third is trying to take an interesting detour, finding a different field or sector or country. If you're interested in, say, global health or some sector of policy that has an international outlook, maybe look at NGOs or maybe look at like international organization where your international and global outlook would be an asset as well. A different course may actually shape a different success along the way for you. And you might actually see your success evolve, or you might find it an interesting way of getting back to the destination of success you had mapped for yourself. And that's what kind of happened with my journey. When I started my PhD, I did not know necessarily what I wanted to do after my PhD. I was open-minded. I had worked in healthcare. I thought I'll go into biotech. In fact, I picked my postdoc in Sloan Kettering just for that reason, so that I would have access to professional network in the biopharma sector in New York City and in the East Coast, as well as I'll start working on projects which are a little bit more applied research or translational, as my PhD research was mostly fundamental biology. But my direction changed because I started volunteering and I started resonating with a different problem, like I said in the beginning, of improving scientific training, of building PhD professional development. And that got me to this different path three, and my success evolved. It was hard to get into this new career field on the temporary visa I was in. It took me about 2 to 3 years of volunteering, building skills, learning about the path, finding mentors, everything that I've outlined in that framework. And then really also having the information of all of the immigration pathways possible to advocate for myself and collaborate with my employers to make this possible and to move into a field that internationals don't typically move into. So through my example, hopefully you can see that it's doable, but you have to stick to really thinking about what are the fundamentals you have to do along the way. Clarifying for yourself what your purpose and intention is in mapping the success path that you are mapping. Coming up with long-term and short-term strategies, whether it's immigration considerations, collaborating and negotiating with your hiring manager and the HR, or really thinking about international options and global mobility after training in the United States. Same thing with learning and development, gather data, looking at landscapes of careers, places that would sponsor for visas. There's a lot of resources out there like My H-1B Jobs or other platforms where you can find out which institutions, which companies sponsor visas. Looking at successful examples of internationals who have charted interesting paths, gone into entrepreneurship, gone into science policy, asking them how did they do it, talking to them, doing informational interviews with them. And then accordingly coming up with your action plan. What should be your skills development? How are you going to build your immigration portfolio that is going to make you competitive in the long term for the paths that you're interested in? How much time would you give yourself for preparation before you get on the job market? And also, what is your path towards immigration? You may not have an exact estimate, but at least start mapping it out. Along the way, you have to be very careful to get access to credible resources. If there is one investment where you should put in some money, it's actually consulting with immigration attorneys early on to see who can really help you and guide you in thinking about how to build your immigration portfolio in the long term. I also want to take a second to really talk about, how to approach setting up a career path outside the United States after your training. You might decide to go back to your country of origin, or you might want to explore a third country. If you are looking more broadly, which this current moment is, it's a wise thing to start looking at where else you could be doing, say, for example, research. One way to think about it is look at countries where by R&D intensity. What does that mean? It means that a lot of countries give out data on what % of their overall GDP they invest in research and development. That is a good indicator or gauge on the research landscape and the innovation potential of the country. AAAS publishes one every year on country by country R&D intensity to see which ones are have potential in the future in specific fields. The second thing to consider is socioeconomic factors, such as what are the salary, cost of living, jobs competitiveness, the culture, the integration possibilities, how open is the society towards global talent, as well as language barriers. Are there specific language requirements in different countries? As I mentioned before, people are sometimes the best resources you have. Talking to international PhDs or any PhD who has migrated to the country that you're looking into, leverage your alumni network. In Jeremy's talk, he talked about how LinkedIn is such a powerful tool to access information about alums, looking at their paths. Look at that, reach out to people, get a lot of the behind the scenes information. There's also open resources like Your Access by the EU, DAD or GAIN for Germany, Going Global, where you can get a lot of information about fellowships, about culture of applying for jobs, as well as career preparation help. The other thing to kind of like look into specifically for PhDs and even more for STEM PhDs are any special talent programs that are available in specific countries that makes entry into those countries for work easier. Right now, there are a lot of countries are opening up recruitment programs for PhDs who are trained in the United States. So take advantage of that. And if you are kind of nervous about making this long-term commitment, maybe you could test out the waters in a new country by moving just for a postdoc to see if that feels like a place you can see yourself long-term, or find a job in a multinational company which has headquarters in the place that you're interested in looking at, and see if you can move there for a year or 2 years to see how you feel about it before you decide on migrating long term. So in closing, some of the key components for successful implementation of this creativity framework of wayfinding to your success destination. One, people. They are the ones who can help you through information, through mentorship, through being your allies and advocates, as well as your sponsors. Second, credible information, as well as success stories of people who have been able to chalk those paths, who are going to really help connect you with what resources and information to gather. The support systems you have, whether they are families, friends, or your community, who are going to be your bedrock along the way. And then leveraging some strategy and planning on looking at return of investment between how much time, energy, and money you want to spend. Most fundamentally, over the long term, small habits hopefully will lead to your mindset and drive to be open to abundance, to lifelong learning and growth. And more importantly, taking leadership of your own career because no one else will do it for you. And finally, if there's something we want to remember from this talk, Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you're a liability. It's hard as an international scholar, but you are an asset. We are all assets to the environment we come to. We bring our global talents to the countries where we train, where we work, and we need to recognize that for ourselves as well as our peers. Finally, there's one thing that the international community does very well, is really collective empowerment and learning. We rely on each other through every challenge, through wayfinding, to making things work, to problem solve. So if you find your way to what your success destination is, first, thank those who helped you along the way. But second, help other international scholars succeed. I found my way to a path where a lot of international folks don't get into, which is a PhD professional, career professional development field. And I started becoming a resource for a lot of folks who were starting to ask about how did you get into this field? Eventually, there are a few of us who are all internationals who have found our way in here. And now we've created a community of practice in the professional society that we serve and called Graduate Career Consortium. And it's called the International GCCers Community of Practice, where we share resources with other hiring managers, how to recruit international PhDs. We share what are some of the specific challenges our students and postdocs face, and how can we better support them. And so think of where you are, in which field you are, where you want to go, how you might become that support system and role model for someone else. Another shout out I want to give is this community called STEM Peers, which does a remarkable job in collective learning and empowerment. Finally, a lot of what I've shared today is through my own experiences, through advising people, through stories of other international scientists. And I've put a lot of this stories, threads, and guidance in my forthcoming book that's called Thriving as an International Scientist. And it's being published by University of California Press in fall of 2025. And if I could use a moment to acknowledge that this happened, not because I was looking to write a book, but because someone in our international community thought there needs to be a book, and they connected the publishers to me. So this was a complete example of the international community looking out for each other and collectively supporting and sponsoring each other. And for this audience, for the first time, it's a great time because just very recently, the publisher sent me the final look of the cover of the book, and I'm happy to share it with you. Hopefully, you can see sort of the connections between science and the internationalism on this cover. With that, I'd like to stop here and take any questions, and hopefully we can discuss some more. Thank you.